food issues are absolutely universal. Every single human being has to eat and has to have some kind of relationship with food, or even lack of it. But it's a universal human issue. So I suspect it will reach out to students maybe even more effectively than some of Y Turing's previous plays. My name is Susan Elkin. I was for many years a secondary school English teacher, and then gradually in midlife moved into journalism and eventually became a full-time journalist. At the moment I am education and training editor for the Stage newspaper and have been now for a number of years. This means that I see an enormous amount of theatre for young people. It also means I'm very connected with young people and the learning that they can derive from theatre. The issues that Hungary addresses are actually quite wide and various. The one, I suppose, which probably interests me most is this conflict between hunger, the father is in India dealing with hungry populations, and the obesity of his child at home. It's pretty damn ridiculous to have half the world hungry, or a substantial part of the world hungry, and the other half dealing with an obesity crisis. You know, the global population has gone seriously wrong. Now, obviously, I'm oversimplifying. I know as well as anybody this is to do with international borders and politics and all the rest of it, and you can't solve it instantly. Of course you can't. But these are subjects that I would like the next generation, who will outlive me by many, many decades, and who have a real future, that I really would like those young people to be thinking about the absurdity of that and trying to find more imaginative ways than my generation has managed to find of dealing with it. And I think Sarah's play Hungry is a pretty good starting point for that, because the boy who's got the obesity problem is not just obese because he overeats. I mean, he's got all sorts of family problems. You know, his father's away, and his mother, who's a good egg in many ways, is not there for him in the modern parlance. And he's contrasting himself all the time with the cleaner, Ruby, and her boy, who are very different and in many ways more sensible, but who haven't actually got anything. So I like the way that is done very much. Well, I suppose there has to be a balance between the science and the education in the play. That probably isn't going to worry most of the audience, who will sit down and watch it as drama, even though they may have been taken there by their science teachers. Or maybe it won't be their science teachers, of course, because the issues in this play are very, very far-reaching. And I would argue that they are very much cross-curricular issues rather than science issues. I mean, maybe it'll be the PSHE, Personal, Social and Health Education teachers, who bring them, or maybe the religious education teachers, or the philosophy, which is still taught in some schools, teachers, or maybe even the good old English teacher who has to deal with just about every issue there is. Not necessarily science. I recently wrote a piece, and I did write the title, which is fairly unusual, called Prejudice Smasher, which was about something completely different. It was about a gay play that's coming into the West End, and I thought it might help to promote equal rights. Now, I think Hungary probably has the potential, in a maybe slightly less dramatic, if that's not a mixed metaphor, way of doing the same thing, because it's very easy to think that the middle class professional people have got it right. If you go to America, where there's a huge obesity problem, it tends, terrible generalisation, but it tends to be the middle classes who are slim and the poorer people who are fat, but not necessarily, for goodness sake. And the good thing about Sarah Daniels' play is that the obesity problem is in the very privileged boy, Xavier, and the one who actually eats a lot less but eats much more sensibly is the other boy, the cleaner's boy, who in many ways has got more common sense and more experience of the world than Xavier. Now, that has potential to make students stop and think about the stereotypical prejudice that I have just illustrated with that example about America. It's so easy to make these judgments and assumptions, and it's a very good thing for students just to be pulled up short and made to think, but hey, wait a minute, for every stereotype you promote, there are lots and lots of exceptions. We have to remember and remind students that food problems and issues are not confined to developing countries. Now, as a teacher, many years in the classroom, with underprivileged communities for much of that time, I was very well aware that I'd got students who were both overfed and malnourished, because of course they were eating all the wrong foods. They weren't being given the fruit and vegetables and sensible protein that my children were getting at home. They were eating vast quantities of totally unsuitable food, which I could see in class was actually affecting their ability to achieve the potential they would have achieved if they'd been properly fed. And I could see that without being a scientist or a doctor or anything else. It was an issue. It's also possible, of course, to be, as Xavier proves in Hungary in the play, grossly obese and malnourished. And I used to see that, examples of that in school all the time. And that isn't necessarily a problem with underprivileged people. It can affect anybody who, for whatever reason, is eating unsuitable food. And I think Sarah does a very good job of raising those issues and inviting students to confront those stereotypes.